So I want to talk a little bit about where we've been and just give some historical context for where this thing came from, and less so on the technical and more just the story, some of my story about where this came from. And then a little bit about where we're headed, at least my thoughts and perspectives on kind of where I see the challenges are right now and what's next. So this was taken in 2007, this screenshot. This was our first Google hit. Right? This was actually a really exciting time for us. Lex, my wife, Lex, wave back there. I know how much you love the spotlight, so everybody, attention there. So Lex has been working in HolacracyOne from the beginning of the organization, and we were out there promoting this new idea, and we got our first web hit. Before this, if you Googled Holacracy, you'd get nothing, zero. Right? Now, I mean, it does say, did you mean Holacracy, or however you pronounce that, with an O, right? But at least there was one web hit. This was 10 years ago, which was actually really exciting for those of us. At this point, it was just Tom, Lex, and I. There's Tom. Tom was there in the beginning. And then today, it's very different. If you Google Holacracy, now, even if you spell it wrong, it says, wait, you really mean Holacracy. I'll give you the real results here. Right, and there's 200 and some thousand it finds, and Google actually only indexes about 4% of the web out there, so there's probably quite a few more hits than this even indicates, right? In 10 years, it's gone from nothing to a worldwide topic of conversation and a movement, which, I don't know, that's kind of exciting for me. It started here in Europe 10 years ago. Again, in 2007, we did our first European tour. And this was a photo from that. This was back when HolacracyOne was really just Tom, Lex, and I. And that's Dennis Whitrock. He brought us to Germany. It was our first Holacracy exposure in Europe about 10 years ago. And we did this tour all around all different cities in Germany. And we were very poor at the time. We were, just left other jobs, making no money at this Holacracy thing yet that nobody had heard of. So we were all crammed in the back of Dennis's little tiny car, driving all around Germany, city to city, doing talks in each of these cities. And then from there we went to the first time I'd ever been to Amsterdam, thanks to Diederik. Where's Diederik? Yeah, Diederik. Diederik, 10 years ago, we were a lot younger then. It's funny looking at these old pictures, what you find. I wish I had a picture of that, but Diederik brought us to Amsterdam and said, I think there's something here in this region that would be ready for this. That's, this is a good place for you to come. So we came here and to Rotterdam, did presentations. I think Amsterdam is probably now the hub of Holacracy in Europe, if not actually the world at this point. Probably more momentum built here in the Netherlands than anywhere else on the planet. And in Europe more broadly than any other continent, far more than in the US right now. In Europe, France is a hub for Holacracy. Bernard Marie, I met in a training many, many years ago, and he started taking it to France, and now there's others doing this work. And I'm not sure we would be here today if it wasn't for some of those early folks that saw something in this and said, let's bring you out, let's do something and spread this. So it really is this community more broadly that I think has gotten this to the point where it's at today. So from there, we did all these stops, all these speaking. I had long hair at this point in time, halfway down my back. You can't quite see it from this picture. And I swear that goatee was in style when this photo was taken. Maybe. Might have been a few years out of style, right? And yeah, this was before my wife convinced me that I was losing the hair anyway, and I should just chop it off while I was ahead. Yeah, it's been quite some time, and at this point in time, when we first started promoting this in Europe and elsewhere in the world, this was our website homepage at the time. We really couldn't afford a graphic designer, so we just used characters, the question mark and exclamation, in lieu of pictures. And just wrote something up and threw it on the web, and our website got like no traffic. Nobody had heard of this thing, nobody cared. But as we got out there, something about this resonated, right? It was hitting on something, and I kind of realized early on we were tapping into something that was deeper than even this thing we had kind of developed, Holacracy. It was landing with people in this deep way, an intuitive way. There was just this resonance, and people stepped up and wanted to support this thing and experiment with it. And from there, things grew. It started spreading, but it took a long time. So Tom has this phrase that I just love. He would say in the beginning when we were just out there trying to get momentum about startups in general. He'd say, 1 would get you 2, and 2 would get you 4, and 4 would get you 8, right? And that really stuck with me. So we went out looking for what is that one first really good client, really good case study doing Holacracy. Right? Knowing that if we got 1, we would eventually get 2. And then those stories would help us get 4. And we went looking. And it was really hard. It took, I don't know, 5 years at least to get to the point where we had a really interesting case study, 1. Right? Now, do you know how many case studies we generate in a month in this broader movement? It's more than I even know. I have people coming up to me I don't even know about that are doing this. But really interesting to see that exponential curve. It started with 1. And I don't know exactly what to count as that initial 1. There were some that started and didn't work, but the one that stood out the most for me was when I met this guy here, David Allen. Where's David? Is he in the room still? Oh, he had to leave. Okay, he'll be back tomorrow. So I met David at a conference, the Conscious Capitalism CEO Summit in the United States. And you know, I was a little nervous of meeting David. He'd been a hero of mine for a while, right? I love his work. Had transformed my life, my career in so many ways. And at this point, I had met some other thought leaders. And every time I had met previous thought leaders, most of the time, it left me feeling like, I wish I had just stuck to reading their book. You know, sometimes the reality of the person didn't quite live up to your idealized image of what this person must be when you love their brilliant work. And so I was kind of dreading meeting David at first because I didn't want that to happen. I loved his work so much. And he proved to be the exception to that trend I had experienced before now. One of the most amazing people I've had the privilege of getting to know along this journey. And you know, he saw something in Holacracy immediately. He saw something in it. He got it quicker than I think almost anyone else I've worked with. It just clicked. And he took it in and he adopted it in his company and climbed the learning curve himself and was just clearly committed to this transformation from the beginning. And then, of course, shared his story, right? And that helped us get another interesting case study and another, and it started building this momentum. You know, and as Tom said, 1 got us 2, 2 got us 4, 4 got us 8, et cetera. And we've climbed this exponential growth curve since then. This is a chart of our web traffic to holacracy.org, right? And notice the first 7 years of that journey there, it's virtually flat, right? I mean, that was almost no traffic. And I'm sure some of that, a lot of that was probably just spam bots, right? And yet, then something happened. And even if you level out, some of those big peaks were from some big media we got, like when Zappos first adopted and others. But even if you average that out, you can see here the beginnings of this exponential curve. And yet we're actually still pretty much climbing that. I mean, it's still fairly early on this exponential curve. And it's one thing to read in theory about exponential growth curves. It's another to actually experience it. Right? You can feel it. I'm sure all of you have had some of this experience. Those of you who've been involved in Holacracy now for a little while, you can feel just the momentum building. It's really remarkable. There's this exponential growth happening, and this. It's really cool. I love this stuff. So, you know, to respond to all that, as we hit this point where growth really started happening and more companies were surfacing and stories were getting spread, it started getting to the point where we needed more people in HolacracyOne, and we started bringing on some new folks that would turn into our first external Holacracy coaches, our first internal people doing Holacracy coaching. And there's Carolyn there. Where's Carolyn in the room? Carolyn, yeah, back there. So many of you know her. She was, along with another guy I'll point out in a minute, she was one of our first people that became a Holacracy coach in HolacracyOne. We didn't bring her in for that. We brought her in to do some operational work and administrative work. Didn't think she'd really be, doing the coaching thing, but she just took to it. I mean, a knack for it. Became one of the most brilliant Holacracy coaches that I've had the pleasure of working with, and has now spread it to lots of others around the globe. Does a lot of our trainings. Many of you know her from that. This was an early HolacracyOne meeting, still in the office of my house. You can see the results of one of our strategy meetings on the wall there. This was about 5 years ago. And at the same exact time, we brought on Olivier, our other first internal Holacracy coach beyond Tom and myself that started this. And you can see this was at our practitioner training, which I think most of you have been through. In the background there, this is before we used GlassFrog. So that was a project board on in tape and all that in the back. When I first met Olivier, I couldn't understand half of what he said with the French accent, but he seemed really smart. So we brought him in, and eventually I got used to the accent. So this really helped catapult yet more growth, right? We've got actual people now that can do this beyond just the three of us that were there from the beginning, Tom, Lex, and me, and we spread more and more companies, and then the media started getting a hold of this. I have a mixed relationship with the media. They get more wrong than they get right and drive me crazy, but nonetheless, they do help us spread this, right? This is, again, another growth curve of just the Google News results. More and more and more, this is becoming a thing, a pretty big thing. So much so that I've now started running into random people that know all about it. You know, I was riding a bicycle through London a year ago even, and then as soon as I got back to my hotel and checked my Twitter feed, somebody had photographed me riding through London saying, "Oh, the Holacracy guy just rode by," right? I was on a scuba diving trip a few months ago in Mexico, and this guy who's diving with me on the boat just started asking me what I do, and I mentioned Holacracy, and he said, "I'm doing my PhD thesis on Holacracy right now, my research," right? Wow, you know? So fascinating to see a random guy on a scuba boat in Mexico, you know? And yet you can just feel this momentum building. It's really incredible. And of course, you know you're kind of in the pop culture mindset when Dilbert starts making fun of you, right? That was a big surprise to all of us involved with this when someday one of us, somebody, I don't remember how we found it, but we didn't know anything about it. We just saw Dilbert was doing this whole series on Holacracy. So that was kind of fun, right? And not too bad too, right? It's fascinating to see this thing grow so virally, organically. We haven't taken out any media campaigns, right? Honestly, we're still figuring out which end is up and how to deal with the media. We haven't taken out any advertising campaigns. This is all spread by people like you all and a whole lot more who just find something in it that makes sense to them and then tell a friend and another friend. And that's what's gotten this kind of massive global viral spread in just a few years, really. And it took us 5 years just to get some initial momentum. And then the last 5 have been this whirlwind of growth. It's been really incredible. And we can see that growth reflected in our community too. This is the hits on our community of practice site, our online forums, where more advanced practitioners come to participate. And anyone who follows it sees just the traffic. I've gone from reading every post to I can't keep up with all this. I have to selectively choose what I engage in. And you can see the growth curve there of more seasoned Holacracy practitioners that are out there doing this. So with, of course, all this growth and success come a lot of new challenges, right? This is spreading. There are more and more companies doing it. And wow, we are running into all sorts of new interesting challenges. So I feel like this is kind of the learning curve now in front of us is how do we deal with all of the new challenges that were luxuries in the first 5-7 years? We never hit them, and now we're hitting them continually, consistently. One of them is how to really support the behavior change of this and get it in deep, right? So more companies, I think right now that adopt Holacracy won't ever make it to a sustainable Holacracy practice than not. That's anecdotal, I don't really know the numbers, but it's a significant rate of companies that don't make it there, that try and stop. Now, when you interview them, and I've talked to many, it's a really interesting thing I notice. Rarely, if ever, do I hear somebody tell me about what they did and describe actually doing Holacracy. Rarely do they get to the point where they're really doing it, they're living it, and then say, no, this doesn't work for us. I don't think it's the right solution. We're going to go back or do something different. Right? Almost all the time, they never got there in the first place. Right? They were never doing something that I would describe as Holacracy. They might have said they were. Some of them might have believed it. Right? But they were never doing anything that looked like true distributed authority, distributed governance, iterative governance happening, nothing like that. They had a management hierarchy really clear, and then maybe some different meeting processes. A lot of people are under the mistaken idea that doing Holacracy means running these meetings. It doesn't. So the challenge of this becomes really clear for me. The people that did get there, when I talk to them, what I hear again and again is, I will never go back, right? And I hear that from people on the front lines and people at the top. I will never go back. So much so that we've had a few cases, failed Holacracy implementations, where even though they never got there to a sustainable practice, we've had people in those companies, after they failed and it collapsed, come up to us and say, are you hiring? Right? I don't want to stay in this company anymore because we're not going to do this. I've tasted what this could be. Right? So there's something here really speaking to people, and yet it's a challenge to get it to stick. And I think this image, anyone recognize the story, what that image is about? So this is, if you watch elephants in like the circus, and they're often tied with a little rope around their neck to this wooden peg hammered in the ground. Do you know how much muscle is on an elephant? Do you think that rope and that wooden peg actually stops it from just pulling it out and walking away? It doesn't. It doesn't at all, but the elephant doesn't try. And they don't try because when the elephant's a baby, they tie a metal chain around its neck, not a thin rope, and they take a giant metal stake driven deep into the ground and they attach it to it. And the elephant does struggle against it, tries to get its freedom, and it learns it can't walk away from that stake in the ground. So it stops trying. And then by the time it's a full-grown adult elephant with enough strength even probably to pull out the chain, they can just switch to a rope and a little wooden peg. They don't try anymore. So I see this in management hierarchies all the time, right? I see the challenges. You can give people all the power in the world. You can, have that CEO sign that constitution, and that doesn't change anything day one, right? Now you've got all of these old behaviors, patterns built in that people are used to that need to shift. And that is an interesting challenge. And I don't know entirely how to solve this one, right? I see some companies make it through it really, really well, right? And some don't. But we're trying to figure this out right now. And this is one of the things we've been working a lot on in HolacracyOne. Chris, where's Chris? Oh, Chris, yeah. Chris has spent, I don't know, a good chunk of the past year working on our habit change program, and just pouring heart and soul into that. And I find it really amazing. And I see the impact in our consulting clients, right? When they go through, there's 6 months worth of habits and lessons to focus on to help with this deep behavior change. And I hear feedback, not a month goes by where I don't get emails from someone saying, wow, I love your habit change program, it's really helping. Sometimes from people that are 5-year veterans in Holacracy, telling me it helps them deepen their understanding and practice. Not just from the novices, it's across the whole spectrum, which is really cool. So much so, I think one of the scariest business decisions we made, for me anyway, in the past year, we took all that content, which is one of the things that was making our consulting services so special. And we said, you know what, let's just put this in Glassfrog and make sure everybody has access to it easily, and much cheaper than hiring us as a consulting firm, which also forces us to level up our game and make sure we're adding yet more value in our coaching and implementation services. But I think that's huge for Holacracy, getting that content out there. And I think it's the beginning. I think we need more programs of some sort to focus on behavior change to get the sustainable Holacracy implementations. But I do think it's a big step. And yeah, what was my next point? So, this is hard. This is deep change work, right? And it's not the only challenge this has brought, but it's come at a new scale. In the early days, the people that adopted Holacracy were so committed and bought in, usually throughout the company. And nowadays it's happening in larger organizations at larger scales. There's much more need for this kind of focus on how are we going to change habits and support people building new ones. How do we embed this as a deep level power shift, not just a new meeting practice, which is not very sustainable. And another of the major challenges I see right now, we need apps. This has really come to my attention over the past couple of years as we get more and more adoptions at scale doing Holacracy. It's kind of like one organization that did this described it as kind of like, feel like I just bought this really cool new operating system for my computer and then learned, no, it doesn't have a word processor, doesn't have an email client or a web browser, right? But it's a really cool operating system. And I think one of the challenges now, we need a standard suite of apps that run on top of this operating system to do things like, bring compensation. This is what Frank was talking about, right? Bring compensation and some kind of performance management, something, right? Standard ways that you can just adopt these, kind of like I can buy a new computer and go download apps on top of them, right? And I think we've seen more and more need for this recently, more so than at any point in the past, possibly because we have more adoptions at larger scales. I see some also really cool app development happening. There's lots of organizations out there innovating in things you build on top of the platform, right? And I think that's where actually it's almost more sexy, right? Like Holacracy itself, the base platform, I love it. Of course, it's really cool, but it takes a certain kind of technical nerd at that level to really appreciate what that's doing. But really cool ways to get paid, that's pretty accessibly cool. And I think that's where a lot is going on. And there's compensation apps now and things like that out there, still underway. One of our goals at HolacracyOne is to suffer so others don't have to. In other words, to experiment on ourselves and try all these new approaches so we can figure out all the things that don't work and the ones that do, and then share that learning with our market. Another example, I was just talking to Tony Shea of Zappos recently, and they're experimenting with this approach now of allowing each circle to be run like a little business with their own profit and loss and their own bank account effectively. Instead of a typical budgeting, it's an actual little business. They can pay for services from other internal circles. It's one really interesting approach they're just starting to experiment towards. In HolacracyOne, one of the challenges, even in our small organization, that we found, step forward, of course, the magical zone where the audio works. Yeah. As somebody who trains at Zoku regularly, this sometimes happens, and it goes away eventually. So one of the things we found at HolacracyOne is it's really hard to prioritize in these environments, right? You've got 20 roles across 5 circles. Right? How do you know what the most important thing to work on is? It's really difficult, right? And of course, the default is use your judgment, which actually in a lot of cases works fine, but it leaves a lot to be desired. You're in this environment where no one person has centralized information to tell you what's the most important thing, right? And if somebody thinks they do, they're probably kidding themselves. They might have some ideas roughly of priorities. So we're experimenting with a new system we call impact points.
Just kill that one and try that.
Sure. We're going to be doing a talk on this tomorrow if you want to dig in a little deeper, but this is some alpha functionality in Glassfrog now, where you can actually see it's a market-based system of figuring out priorities, where you can kind of fund bounties. It's very gamified. Fund bounties on projects or role assignments, right? And they can be funded almost Kickstarter style from lots of different roles that have a stake in them. And then ultimately, you can figure out what's the most important thing or valuable thing to work on by saying, hey, how can I collect the most impact points in bounties? Right? And this doesn't have to and won't for us tie to compensation or anything like that. It's just an internal game to figure out what's the most valuable use of your time. Right? So it's a price system, really. Pricing is an information discovery algorithm in a market. And those are the kinds of apps I think we really are going to see more of, and really need more of, is self-organizing systems, enabling self-organizing systems to figure things out. The other trend I'm seeing is more and more practice is becoming asynchronous, right? So we use Slack in HolacracyOne, and I process proposals now entirely from Slack. I don't even go into Glassfrog for it. We just shipped this, but we've been using it internally for a little while now. And every proposal comes into my Slack feed, and I can respond right in here, no objection, or bring to meeting. I can start a thread and ask clarifying questions or share a reaction, right? And I'd say most of the proposals I'm processing over the past month have been asynchronous, all in Slack, without ever leaving my main interface for getting work done, which is pretty cool. I'm seeing the same demand on the operational side, right? More need to not just have regular tactical meetings every week, but asynchronous access to metrics and project updates and things like that, so that you can really maximize the meeting time and the value of that for the stuff we really do need to discuss when we have a team full of autonomous, entrepreneurial, self-managed people, right? So other things coming soon to GlassFrog will help with that as well. And I'm mentioning GlassFrog a lot here because one of the things I'm noticing about the development of Holacracy itself is it's getting more and more integrated with toolset. Right? You can't do certain functions of Holacracy without the right tool to support you. In fact, even Holacracy itself, I think you need some kind of habit change program here. More so if you're not using an external coach, which I think, like Frank said, I recommend too, use a coach if you can, of course, to people, but the majority of Holacracy implementations starting today are not using coaches. They're DIYers, do-it-yourselfers. And that's partly why the failure rate's going up, right? They're not getting the help they need, and yet they're going to keep doing it, right? And we can't tell everyone to get a coach. Some people can't. So we're going to need more and more tools to bake in Holacracy and really help them do it. So I see the evolution of Holacracy going with the tool evolution as well to support it. Right? So one of the directions you'll see, at least from us, is more and more support for asynchronous practice to maximize your actual meeting time. Here's another kind of cool piece. So this is a screenshot from our in development version right now of GlassFrog, and you'll see the projects there on our role. This is actually a role for this conference that Rebecca fills, speaker host, and the role has some projects on it here. But you see with the projects, they're associated with the accountabilities of the role. So you can actually see, what are the accountabilities and what are they doing to enact those projects. And if I care about this role, I can come in and see if there's an accountability with no projects listed for it. Right, and I can then go and say, hey, Rebecca, what are you going to do with that accountability? Can you add a project? And as this starts getting more connected with our habit support, GlassFrog will do that for me. Right? It'll say, hey, Rebecca, through a habit support lesson, I noticed that you don't have projects for all of your accountabilities, so get creative. What can you do to express that? And kind of then teach people good individual organizational practice to really connect it so the roles and the accountabilities get really connected into the day-to-day individual management, self-management. I think that's the other side of this self-management. We need that connected into our organizational management, deeply intertwined. And I think the tools can help people learn that. And in version 5.0 of Holacracy, we'll have some differentiated types of accountabilities. So it can tell exactly which ones should have projects associated and which ones maybe shouldn't. Not all accountabilities should, but some really should at all points in time. So GlassFrog's going to be getting a lot smarter in conjunction with the development of Holacracy itself, which I think is pretty cool. Even to the point where you can go in, if you care about one of these, click a button, and then bam, up in somebody else's inbox pops, hey, someone would like you to process this accountability. You have no project associated. Right, here's why that's important, and here's the rule in the Constitution for it. The other thing you'll see here is those projects are not pulled from just GlassFrog itself. We're in the middle of a sync right now. I use OmniFocus, and we're in the process of developing a two-way sync. So whatever self-management system you use can be synced two-way, kept in sync in GlassFrog. So everyone can use their own individual organizational system, and then at a team level, get it connected to the roles and accountabilities here, which I think is pretty cool. And finally, where is this all headed? I was originally going to talk about, maybe far future, and I realized I have no idea. I don't know where this is going. I look back at the past 10 years and this whirlwind of growth. I have no idea what the future holds. The cool thing is I don't have to. The beautiful thing about self-organization is you don't need to know exactly where it's headed. You just need to trust the process. And ultimately, where Holacracy and this whole movement is headed is really much more dependent on all of you and all of us, really. This is way outgrown my thing and HolacracyOne's thing. This is a movement so far beyond. And where is this headed? I think depends where do we want to nudge it. Because no one of us gets to direct this and control this. It's way past that. But we each get to nudge it just a little. And maybe if we're all just nudging it just a little in the same direction, we'll achieve some really big results together. So thank you all for being part of this community, and it's an honor to serve you. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks, Brian. We've got some time for questions here. So questions?
One of the things I need to sell Holacracy in Peru is, successful cases in the media. And Zappos is a very important company, but is there new articles, after the big articles that 40% of the workforce left Zappos? Is there any articles about if they're happy with the Holacracy and all that? Or any other cases which you think are worth it that we should consider?
Yeah, there's a bunch of stuff out there. There are some in Zappos that I think are more well-researched and genuine. There's stuff that is pure hype cycle and bears almost no reality to what's going on in the company. But hunt around. Harvard Business Review has done, I think, 1 or 2 decent ones on Holacracy out there, still with a little bit of misinfo, but mostly accurate. There's been some others. And then, of course, there's a lot of just sensationalized clickbait that doesn't seem to connect anything. And, that's still helping to spread Holacracy. It's funny to see how that works. But there'll be others as well. I think we need more than just one organization out there. Zappos is a great case study. Everything I hear, I just spoke to Tony a couple weeks ago, I'm hearing it's going great. That said, we need more. I hope some of you in this room will help us create more case studies. It's already happening, right? We just saw one this morning with Washington Tech Solutions. So we'll see more. We are looking at some more media strategy stuff, so we might be able to help with some of that. But again, we're just one drop in the bucket. So I encourage anyone who can help get stories out there. It's needed. Let's get more stories out there.
Yeah. Hey, Brian. You personally and your colleagues of H1 have done an incredible job birthing this, bringing this into the world. Given this question, where is this headed? I'm curious if you have any clarity at least about H1's role in where the Holacracy movement is going. How do you see that?
Yeah, it's funny. At the very beginning, even before HolacracyOne, it was kind of like this was kind of my thing, right? And then I got to the point where I met up with Tom and he joined forces with me and Lex joined. We started HolacracyOne and it became HolacracyOne's thing, right? And it started developing further. That was before the first constitution. We created that in that process, and then it became this company's thing with a movement, right? It was HolacracyOne's thing with this whole movement that it was starting to steward and grow. And I think the position we're in now that we're finding is we're moving from a company with a movement to a movement with a company that helps support it, one of many, right? And I think that's a really cool transition. So I do see us as having a role in that, absolutely. A stewarding role, if you will, but not as a lead anymore. I think that's, it used to be our movement. It's not. It's your movement. It's the world's movement. It's nobody's movement. It's a movement. And we're one organization there helping to throw some new energy into it and fill some important roles in it and catalyze it. And so are others. So I think it's kind of making that shift. Another way of saying it for my own sake, and this is hard, I'm still figuring this out. I used to, in the early days, I think appropriately, related to this much like a parent would with a 2-year-old, right? This thing was new, it was vulnerable. I can't tell you how many people wanted to just dismiss it as just yet another flavor of the month thing, right? And so I protected it. I held it, I stewarded, I controlled it, as you would with a 2-year-old. And now the shift is much more like finding this adult-to-adult relationship, right? Where as a parent still, I can recognize I and HolacracyOne more broadly serve an important role in this child's journey, but it's no longer one of command at all, right? It's there, it's supportive, it's nurturing in a way, but not in a parent-to-child way anymore. And I think right now Holacracy is somewhere in that puberty realm, right? Somebody said this in our morning table. It was great metaphor. Like, where is it? It's not totally there yet. It's still in that, but that's the messy part where we're trying to figure out our relationship to it. I'm trying to figure out how I can best serve this and relate to it when it's now so far beyond anything I can directly control, let alone barely even directly influence. It's so big. Which is cool. I don't know. I'm holding the question.
Yeah, Brian, thanks a lot for this outlook and this looking back. And you said something about, if I understood correctly, but I would like to check back with you, an increasing number of DIY implementations. And I would like to know, could you share a little bit more data or maybe also a hypothesis? Because we have a lot of insight into the market and the organizations, and we see and we also have contact with people from the movement, as you said, doing in DIY, but it's a small number from our perspective. So I wondered whether it's about the availability of providers or licensed external coaches, or do you have first assumptions what's behind that pattern?
Yeah, so I suspect there might be even more than you see. There's certainly more than I see directly, but you can tell just looking at GlassFrog statistics, the number of companies that are in GlassFrog actively doing, regularly meeting, that no one in our coach network has ever heard of, right, is actually quite sizable and growing at a decent clip. Some of them don't seem to even know what Holacracy is. They think they do. I mean, they heard about it. So, some of them are learning it, but from the book. And, that's a really tough way to learn, really tough way. And the failure rate, of course, high. But I think what's driving that is just the popularity. People, there's a book. People read the book and hand it to colleagues, and they read the book. And some of them think, I'll just try doing this, Cool. That's what I would have done when I was arrogant young prick, as Chris said I confessed to, which I did. That's what I would have done. 15 years ago, you hand me a book on this stuff, I would have read it and assumed, this sounds easy. I can totally do this. I don't need a coach. Right? I would have been wrong, but I would have tried. And I think there's a lot of people doing that, and some of them for good reasons. They can't afford a coach, or there's the coaches, as some of you know, we're really busy. It's hard to keep up with demand in a lot of ways now, which is a great problem to have, but not if you're a do-it-yourselfer that does want a coach and you're trying to find support. So again, that's where there are successful cases that companies that took that DIY approach and made it really work. I hope the habit support program being broadly available helps make that even higher of a percentage. But it is hard, and I think it's only going to grow. Just like any movement, I think the percentage of companies that I'll say are wise enough to know they could use some real help on this and get a coach and can afford it, right, and can sell whoever has to sign off on that check that they need a coach is a fairly small percentage of those that are inspired to try something new, which I actually think is a great thing. I mean, at first I wanted to stop all of them and say, no, only use a coach. I want this to be done well for good stories, right? But the reality is, if we want this thing to be way bigger than just whatever us coaches in the room can handle, we've got to find more ways to support do-it-yourselfers and at least make their odds a little better, and yeah.
We've got time for one more question.
Oh. Thank you. So Brian, as all of us know that so far the biggest company in the world whom running Holacracy is still the Zappos. But on the other hand, we have a lot of the MNC, or let's say the huge companies, maybe they have 100 million employees. They start to try and pilot Holacracy even with a small organizational group. But so far we don't have, any of them fully adopt Holacracy. The huge company. So for you, what's the biggest challenge for those companies and how we can move forward?
Yeah, those leaders, as we heard with Michael D being in a much bigger entity trying to do this, right? It's hard to do this in part of a company. There's a lot of challenges. And there are a lot now doing that. We've worked with many, there are many others. I know IGI has worked with a bunch that have giant companies with stable Holacracy practices in one team or department. It's just really hard. What's stopping them, what's needed? It's very rare to see a leader like Tony for a company of that size, and they're fairly small. Zappos is 1,600 people or something like that. But he's all in on self-organization and self-management, and you can tell, right? He's even going so far as trying to find ways so that each circle can be run like a little business with its own profit and loss, statements and its own internal marketplaces. And that takes a lot of willingness to innovate and to take risks. It's really rare to see a big company with that kind of support for something like this. Will we find it? I hope so. I think it's going to be really hard to scale from the bottom up. And I hope I'm wrong. I hope somebody proves me wrong. But taking one department or one team in a giant entity and then spreading it up, I think is really difficult. Taking one and cordoning it off and saying, we're going to do something differently in this one, I think is very possible. But then again, maybe those ones will inspire something else, will inspire something next, right? And that's ultimately what I think the value of that is, seeing it's possible, which is what I think many of you are showing and doing now in organizations that are bigger. I know some of you are. You're showing it's possible, right? That this can work, which creates maybe some openness. Or at the very least, eventually that current generation of managers who are not interested in this will eventually die. Sometimes, a philosopher quote here, sometimes evolution precedes funeral by funeral, right? As one generation dies off and leaves room for the next that has a new paradigm kind of in their heart. Now, let's hope we can accelerate that a little so we don't have to wait for that generational shift, right? But that's the work we're involved in, all of us. Yeah.
Thanks, Brian. So we're at time. So I know some of you had questions, but we're just beginning, right? This is the first day of the forum. So let's give a big round of applause here to Brian.